This next progression is probably the most interesting of the whole course, at least from the perspective of composition. For this one, instead of starting it from scratch, I ended up basing it on a progression from a section of my song Quoth the Looming Dusk found on my first album. This progression is far more melodic and harmonic than what we've done previously, sounding less like a composition made for a course on arpeggio progressions and more of just a straight composition. This is due to a few factors. One is the introduction of clear motifs. Another is the movement that occurs even within sections that have repeating triads underlying the chords. This is particularly apparent when comparing measures 1 and 2, where even though in both cases the arpeggios are simply D minor to A7, the melody is clearly evolving, a motif is introduced, and there's also clear movement. From the perspective of the implied bass line, you'll notice a very distinct pattern of bass notes in measures 3 and 4 and measures 7 through 12. You'll also notice that we're now going out of our way for the sake of the bass line, including a descending chromatic bass line in measures 9 and 10. If you listen carefully, you should be able to pick out what clearly sounds like a melody line, a harmony line, and a bass line emerging from the overall composition, even though it's monophonic. Measures 1 and 2 and measures 5 and 6 use a different structure based on one ascending and one descending arpeggio, while the previously mentioned measures, or rather the rest of the measures, use mostly descending to ascending arpeggios, with just 2 examples of that pattern being broken, either lead us back down to the root chord or to ascend the progression to the climactic finale. There's a clear juxtaposition of the parts that begin with ascending arpeggios and the parts that use descending to ascending arpeggios. When you hear it, it should be pretty clear to you what it's doing. We're also now bringing in a major 7th interval at one point, which we'll talk more about when we get there. While this is a pretty challenging composition to play, it's incredibly satisfying to get down. Our first part uses an ascending D minor arpeggio that switches to a descending A7 arpeggio. Note that the A7 is the dominant 7th chord of D minor. While there isn't much of interest in this section by itself, pay close attention to how the pattern of each of these sections relate to the following sections. This next part also uses an ascending D minor arpeggio to a descending A7 arpeggio. However, while they start off the same, the A7 is voiced considerably differently, with the final note being of particular interest in how it leads us to the next section. Now we have the first one of the measures that uses a different overall structure. Here, we start with a descending to ascending E diminished 7th arpeggio, and then go to a descending to ascending D minor arpeggio. E diminished 7th is of course the diminished 7th chord found in D harmonic minor. This is the chord that shares 3 notes with the dominant 7th chord, which in D minor is A7. Notice that the previous section ended with an A7, and the last note that led us to that part was a C sharp. That C sharp is the sharp 7 that changes D minor to D harmonic minor, and it's also the 3rd of A7. However, here it's more interesting because it's shared by the dominant 7th arpeggio we're moving from to the diminished 7th arpeggio we're moving to. Because it's the leading tone found in D harmonic minor, it has significant power to draw the ear back to the root D. So to use that note as a transition between the dominant 7th and the diminished 7th creates a very particular sound. That's because it gives us an expectation of resolution, but we're actually increasing dissonance instead. While it may not strike you on its own, its function will be more clear in the context of the overall composition. In this progression, pay attention to how the last note of each measure works with the first note of the next measure. This section introduces a structure that will be used a lot in this progression, and that gives us the sense of walking up or down. Now we have another of the walking sections. This one goes from E7 to A7. What makes the E7 interesting here is that it uses the B natural and A flat. D minor naturally has a B flat, so a B natural is an accidental and functions as a major sixth, which is what you'd find in D melodic minor. The A flat is another accidental as a flat fifth of the key of D minor, which is also a very common accidental found in all types of classical music. The A7 is, of course, our dominant seventh chord again. Notice how the pattern of descending to ascending arpeggios, established in the last exercise, is now broken with the A7 arpeggio, which is simply descending. There are three interesting things about this descending arpeggio. First of all, it's descending to bring us back to the root of D minor, so its pattern alone is telling us to expect that resolution. However, it's also the dominant seventh chord, which is both the fifth chord of D minor and uses the sharp seventh, or leading tone, of D harmonic minor. This way, the arpeggio itself is doubly pulling us back to the root chord of D minor. But there's more even than that. The last note of the descending arpeggio is the fifth of D minor, again pulling us towards resolving down to a D minor arpeggio. In that way, this arpeggio is pulling us back down to D minor in four ways. But as you'll see in the next section, it doesn't resolve exactly as it's telling us to expect. Instead of going back down to the previously established low octave of D minor, we're descending down in order to jump up and resolve on a higher octave of D minor. These types of contrasts can be used to dramatic effect and can be emphasized in many more than the four ways I've used here. But not to give the wrong impression, it's important that I point out that while writing this progression, I didn't do any of these things consciously, but I merely followed my ear. However, it's the fact of learning how and building the habits of analyzing music in this way and beginning to experiment with these types of things that will allow you to gain an intuitive sense for this type of composition. If you're aware of even just a few elements like these, you can go back over something you've written and intentionally make changes like these to exploit some of these effects. The more you do that, the more you'll cement the ideas in your unconscious, and the more you'll begin to recognize it in music. And from there, it will begin to naturally come out while you're playing, improvising, and writing solos or compositions. So now we're making that leap up to the next octave after our somewhat misleading transitional A7 descending arpeggio. From the perspective of a standard song format, you could think of this as being something like returning to the verse. Here we again have the ascending D minor arpeggio going to the descending A7. Of course, now we've escalated things by going up to that higher octave. Other than being played an octave higher, this section is actually identical to the first part of this progression, at least in terms of what notes are being played. Of course, the types of sweep patterns we're using are different now. We're back to that standard minor 5-string sweep pattern from back in exercise 5. For the A7, we're again playing that arpeggio pattern that's so similar to a type of diminished arpeggio pattern, like we talked about earlier in the course. Of technical interest here is how we transition between the two arpeggios. In this case, the D minor and A7 patterns are played back to back as if they're a single pattern. At the end of the D minor, we hammer on from the 13th fret to the 17th fret, which just so happens to be a high A, a note that's shared by both arpeggios, being the 5th of D minor and the root of A7. From that hammer on to the 17th fret, we immediately pull off now to the 12th fret to continue down what's now the A7 arpeggio. This transition may be fairly awkward at first, since you need to shift your first finger from the 13th fret to the 12th fret during the instant that the 17th fret is ringing out, allowing for a clean hammer pull. Don't be discouraged if this gives you some trouble at first. As with the other unusual transitions we've gone over, and still have to go over, some time with the metronome will be enough to make it become natural for you. If it does give you trouble, as with anything else, I'd recommend isolating it with the metronome. In this case, you can easily just practice playing the 13th fret with your first finger, hammering on the 17th fret with your fourth finger, and then immediately pulling off to the 12th fret with your first finger. And you can just do that on repeat with the metronome, gradually increasing the speed. Now we have a callback to the second measure of the progression, only this time we have some notable changes. First of all, instead of an A7 arpeggio, we now have an A major 7. We're also changing the whole feel of the section by offsetting the notes by 1 at the start of the D minor arpeggio. Notice how, while in the last part, we started the D minor on the 17th fret of the 5th string and ended on the 17th fret of the 1st string. Now we're starting with the 12th fret of the 5th string and ending on the 13th fret of the 1st string. This does a few things in the context of the overall composition, but you'll see right away that that high A on the 17th fret, shared by both arpeggios, has now been pushed forward into being part of the A major 7 arpeggio, instead of the D minor arpeggio as it was before. The major 7th interval here is acting more as a passing tone accidental than as an actual harmony of A, but it makes more sense in the context of this course. Think of it all together as an A major 7 arpeggio. If you're familiar with my music or my instructional content in general, then you'll know that I'm a big fan of creating false leading tones with accidentals. In a sense, that's exactly what we're doing here by playing the G sharp as a major 7th of A. Now we're back to the contrasting structure with the walking arpeggios. This exercise is almost melodically identical to exercise 57, save for the fact that it's played an octave higher. Again, we have an E diminished 7th and D minor arpeggio walking down, each descending and ascending. However, there's one note that's different now, and that's the first implied bass note. If you're not sure what that is, it's the 4th note of the measure. In exercise 57, it's a B flat, the flat 5th of the E diminished 7th arpeggio. In this exercise, that note has been changed to G, the minor 3rd of the E diminished 7th. Besides being a minor 3rd lower than before, it won't be immediately apparent why this change is significant. That's because, in the context of this one part, it's not really doing very much. It's not about how it relates to the other notes of the E diminished 7th arpeggio, but how it relates to the implied bass line that matters. In the context of the full progression, you should have little difficulty hearing why I changed that particular note. In case you're not sure what notes are in the implied bass line, for these walking sections, the bass notes can be found as the 4th note played for each arpeggio. That makes up the 4th and 10th notes of each of these walking measures. Now we have a callback to the 4th section of the overall progression, found in exercise 58. Again, we have an E7 to A7, as we did before, and of course this time it's played an octave higher. The E7, like the E diminished 7th in the last exercise, matches the notes of the previous E7, except for the implied bass note, and for the same reasons. The A7 is more interesting in relation to its earlier counterpart. If you recall from exercise 58, the A7 broke from the descending to ascending pattern and simply descended, using a number of avenues to create an expectation of resolution on the D minor. This time, instead of descending, the A7 is ascending to bring us up to the climactic final sections of the progression. Instead of resolving to a D minor, this dominant 7th arpeggio is now morphing into its imperfect doppelganger chord in harmonic minor, the E diminished. To make that transition, it ends on a high A, which is a half step below the B flat, the only note difference between A7 and E diminished 7. The next part will begin on that B flat on the 18th fret, and then continue through 2 of the shared notes between the 2 arpeggios, leading to a very satisfying transition and emphasizing the tension that will be introduced by the climactic final sections of the progression. From the perspective of standard songwriting, if measures 1 to 2 and measures 5 to 6 could be thought of as the verse parts, and measures 3 to 4 and 7 to 8 could be thought of as maybe chorus parts, then this part could be seen as the start of a bridge. As you'll see, it's not really the best analogy for this type of composition, but hopefully it'll at least make my point for me. Here we have a real escalation in the composition. We're using a familiar two chords for this part, the E diminished seventh and D minor. Technically, this is just an E diminished in D minor, but they're now causing a very different effect. We've now gone up to a higher position, and we're playing them in different inversions. The implied bass line of the previous two sections was preparing us for the descending chromatic bass line of this and the following section. Not only are the arpeggio shapes walking down the fretboard, but the bass notes of these and the next two arpeggios are walking down one half step at a time. In this exercise, all we can see of the bass line so far is the 15th fret going to the 14th fret. For this section, we're continuing to descend, but now we've simply flatted the fifth of the D minor to change it into a D diminished arpeggio. This creates a tense transition and also allows us to get the next note in our chromatically descending bass line. As you'll see by putting this and the last section together, the bass line goes down the third string on the 15th, 14th, 13th, and 12th frets. In terms of the arpeggios walking down, pay close attention to the arpeggios of this and the last exercise. We have E diminished to D minor to D diminished to E diminished 7. Each one is walking down from the last one. The root notes of these arpeggios would go E to D to D to E, but the arpeggios descend each time. The idea demonstrated here is extremely important to styles like neoclassical, jazz, fusion styles, and even just composition in general. That idea is that any chord can be cleanly transitioned to or from any other chord, either walking up or down. As you'll see by these two sections, this concept isn't about simply playing chords in different octaves. By using different inversions or voicings of the chords, you can make the chords or their arpeggios work for you however you need to, both in terms of movement and harmony. Also, pay close attention to the last two notes of this section. The two arpeggios D diminished and E diminished 7 are almost identical to each other here, with almost every note being mirrored one half step lower. However, that pattern is broken on the second to last note, where we go up to the 17th fret on the second string, instead of going back to the 14th fret when we return up the pattern. This change was important to the composition, but makes for a pretty awkward fingering in transition. This took me some extra time to perfect when mastering this composition before filming this course, and so I highly recommend taking your time with it. In my case, my playing habits kept wanting me to play the 14th fret instead of the 17th fret on the way back up, and so it took some additional repetition to cement that change. This is a perfect example of how our playing habits will try to force us to play what's most expeditious instead of what's best for the music. The best habit an advanced guitarist can build is to always apply an equivalent amount of force when encountering resistance. For the second to last part of the progression, the walking arpeggios are now changing direction. We ended the last section on the 15th fret of the first string. Now we've transitioned to a D minor arpeggio, starting on the 17th fret of the first string. From here, we slide up to an E arpeggio, stepping briefly outside of D minor again, as we did with the earlier E7. For the last section of this progression, we briefly resolve up to the highest octave we've now played of our root D minor arpeggio, and that's before stepping down from that peak to create one last bit of tension with the E diminished 7th, and that sets us up either to resolve finally on a D minor or to repeat the entire progression again from the beginning. For the D minor arpeggio, we have to use string skipping in order to reach down to the note we need for the bass line on the 4th string. Here I'd consider my preference of picking direction to be purely that. I'd recommend using whatever picking direction is most comfortable for you to achieve the smoothest transition between the 2nd and 4th strings. For the E diminished seventh, we run into some serious weirdness. First of all, we're sliding from the last note of D minor on the 22nd fret of the first string to the 21st fret of the first string with the fourth finger. Instead of pulling off, as we've mostly been doing after one of these sliding transitions, we're immediately moving to the second string, where we have a pull off from the 20th fret to the 17th fret. In order to accomplish this, we're using the fourth finger on the first string, and then the third and first fingers for the pull off on the second string. From there, we'll use the second finger on the 18th fret of the third string, and somewhat counterintuitively now, we skip an interval and go to the 17th fret of the fourth string with the first finger again. This is another technical sacrifice for the sake of the bass line, which I hope is developing a real appreciation for us by now. At this point, if you wanted to end the progression right there, you could just play any nearby D, or even just pull off to the open D on the fourth string. However, since I've set this progression up to be repeated, we have a two-string jump back to the first string to play an open E. That open E serves two purposes. First of all, it gives the fretting hand just enough time to jump all the way back to fifth position to start the progression over again. The second purpose is that E is the second note of the key of D minor, creating a transition of simply walking back from the second note to the root, E to D. This one has quite a few unexpected technical challenges, and I highly recommend trying to get the whole thing down at half speed before trying to play it any faster. This one is also a perfect candidate for creating subsections to practice and working on specific parts and transitions. It may take you a considerable amount of time to actually master this, but the benefits of doing so will be enormous. Remember that mastering something like this on the guitar doesn't just add one new composition to your repertoire. It works out so many nooks and crannies of technique and increases your general playing skill enough that everything you learn afterwards will be that much easier to learn and master as a result. Even though I've been playing pieces of music like this for many years now, I still gain a tremendous amount of satisfaction from getting down a piece of music like this. The type of momentum that kind of satisfaction will build for you cannot be overstated.